Hey guys, Will here. So today we're taking a look at the new Thrustmaster T598 sim racing bundle, which includes wheelbase, pedals, and basically everything that you need to get up and racing. Now they're making some pretty big claims in their marketing. Drive into a new era of sim racing, they say. This motor allows for perfect clear wheel rim motion with no cogging for high fidelity force feedback. Too good to be true? Well, that's what we're going to be testing today. So stick around, this should be a really interesting one. Okay, so we've got a lot to go through today. This is a brand new direct drive technology called Direct Axial Drive. We want to unpack that a little bit and explain exactly what that is all about. But before we get into that, firstly, a couple of quick housekeeping things just to have the full context of exactly what we're doing today. So firstly, big thank you to Thrustmaster for sending across this gear for us to check out. They've sent us pretty much everything within their current sim racing ecosystem. And we are going to be going through a series of videos over the next few months, checking out things like the T818, a bunch of their steering wheels, accessories, and so forth. So definitely subscribe so you don't miss out on those. But as is always the case here at Boosted Media, we like to cross-compare these things against some of the competitor products within the market. It's important that you guys know that all of the products that we're talking about today have all been sent to us under the exact same conditions. Now, if you do decide you want to pick up any of the gear that we talk about in today's video, we do have some links available down in the description below, as well as some discount codes that'll help you save a little bit of cash as well. So that's an awesome way of helping support our work here at Boosted Media at no additional cost to you, and we really do appreciate your support there. But as is always the case here, there's absolutely no third party involved in the production of this video whatsoever. Everything we're going to be talking about today is purely just my own observations and my own opinions of the product. So with that said, let's dive in now and talk about pricing. So as I mentioned in the intro, this bundle comes with everything that you need to get up and racing out of the box, obviously minus a console or PC and a screen, but does come with a table clamp, mounting brackets, steering wheel, the wheelbase itself, the quick release, and of course the pedals included. And that all comes at a price of $499.99 US, €499.99 Euro as well, or 449.99 British pounds. Now this wheelbase has a claimed continuous torque of 5 Newton meters, but it also has an interesting overshoot feature which allows it to deliver more strength in short bursts depending on what's going on the circuit. So that's something that we'll explore in more detail when we get into driving a little bit later on. But for now, 5 Newton meters of continuous torque. And as you might have already noticed, there is a little PlayStation logo on the front of the wheel as well. So this bundle is PlayStation compatible, which is a very big deal because there aren't a whole lot of competitor products that offer that same compatibility. So the only real competitor, at least in this segment of the market, is the Fanatec GT DD Pro. Now that is available in a variety of configurations, and I'll link down to our buyer's guide down below as well as the product page so you guys can check that out for yourselves. But a basic bundle comparable to what we have here in front of us is $699.95 US. So significantly more expensive than what we have here for a similar, at least on paper, kind of feature set. Now, if you're not interested in console compatibility, you just want to race on PC, you do have a lot more options available to you. You got things like the Fanatec CSL DD 5 Newton meter bundle, and they're ready to race bundles that come with a wheel, base, quick release, and pedals. Start at $399.95 US and then go up from there depending on the configuration that you want. It is important to note though that those bundles don't come with a table clamp included, so that will be an additional cost. And then if you're not worried about console compatibility, you do also have the Moza R5 bundle, which comes in at $459 US. Obviously you need to factor in local taxes and shipping into all of these prices. And again, that's not console compatible, although it is Xbox compatible if you purchase their Xbox compatible wheel separately. So that is another option. Now there are a couple of other options available on the market too. Most notably from Camus, the C5 and maybe even the C12, and of course also the more recently released Turtle Beach Velocity 1 race. We have checked out all of those in other videos as well, so definitely recommend check out the reviews of those so you understand a little bit more about those and why we're not really including them in the direct comparison here, because there are a few more compromises involved in those particular products. So we're not going to dive into those in a whole lot of detail in today's video. Now just to fill in the context a little bit more here, of course there are a whole bunch of other belt driven and cog driven products available from both Thrustmaster and Logitech. This is far, far, far better than all of those. So if you're in the market for one of these and you're wondering whether it's worth buying this over one of those belt or cog driven alternatives, absolutely, yes, 100%. Look at this or one of the other alternatives that we'll be covering in today's video. Absolutely, unequivocally better than every single one of those. So really when you boil it down, the product that this is going head to head with is the Fanatec GT DD Pro, which does come in at $200 US, which is a significant percentage of the overall price more expensive than what this is. So there's obviously going to be a lot of people that are going to be very interested in this, and Thrustmaster have been very clever at the way they've tried to position this as a new technology that, you know, people are going to assume is superior to anything else that's available on the market at this point. So let's unpack this in more detail now and explain exactly what direct axial drive technology is and how it varies from conventional direct drive wheelbases. Now, direct axial drive means that they're using an axial flux style motor for their direct drive wheelbase. Now, this varies from a conventional direct drive motor because the magnetic flux is operating parallel with the shaft of the motor rather than perpendicular. So I've got a shaft out of a pretty standard direct drive motor here. This is from a Moza R16. So I'll spin it around here. You've got the bearing in the front, which is what it rotates on, and the shaft obviously spins like this, and then the magnetic forces are operating perpendicular to this like any conventional style motor. Now, unfortunately, I can't completely tear this apart and show you the inner workings, but we do have a couple of images here that will give you a better idea of what's going on. So we'll flip it around here. I have taken the back cover off for you so you can have a look here. And you can see we've got this big housing here, which is basically where the assembly of the motor sits. And when we rotate the shaft like this, we've got this whole assembly which is rotating internally. And if we tip it on its side here, you should hopefully be able to see the back of that rotor rotating relative to the angle or position sensor on the back here. So this entire assembly is moving. One thing that you will notice immediately, and one of the advantages of this style of motor, is that it doesn't have any cogging or any torque ripple at all. So that free spins absolutely smoothly. So in a conventional direct drive motor, at least at around this kind of price point within the market, there's always a certain level of cogging which takes place. And what causes that is the change in magnetic field as you pass each magnet during the rotation. So the shaft is always going to try to sort of rotate itself to, you know, the area of most attraction magnetically. Now, more expensive direct drive wheelbases, once you start to get into the multiple thousands of dollars, don't suffer from this because they simply have more coils and more magnets. So there's more positions around the rotation, I guess, to put it as simply as possible. But with this style design motor, one of the advantages is that you just don't get any sensation of that at all. And so if I quickly flip that quick release open again here, there we go, and chuck the steering wheel back on again, one of the things you'll notice here is that when I spin the wheel, it keeps spinning for ages and ages and ages because there's so much inertia within that shaft. So they say that one of the advantages of this style of motor as well is it can be extremely responsive, but it's obviously going to have to overcome the rotating mass inherent in the system here as well. But we'll get into all that side of things and how it impacts the driving experience later on in today's video. I know that you guys are super keen to learn all about that, but I want to give you just a quick understanding of how the technology behind this works before we dig into the hardware itself. So look, the advantages to this type of motor on paper, at least, are that it's more electrically efficient, more scalable as well in terms of power delivery. So that means theoretically, at least, you should get more precision and more power at a lower cost. But of course, because of the axial design here, it does mean that the actual physical body of the motor needs to be quite large. So that does have some limitations in terms of placement on your sim rig. We'll talk about that a little bit later on as well. And I'll put some measurements up on the screen for you now so you can see exactly what you're going to be dealing with this base. But let's dive more into the actual physical design of this guy now, talk about the quick release, talk about the screen, and all of those important details. So the main bezel here, or fascia, is made of black plastic. This interesting design that you can see on the internal parts here is actually part of the cast aluminium housing for the motor itself. And although it does look quite interesting, this actually has a physical purpose as well. So what it's doing is it's increasing the surface area for heat dissipation. So it's what some of you might know as a heat sink, so to speak. Now, one thing that I did notice when I was driving is that this thing does get quite warm when you run it at maximum power. It certainly doesn't get hot by any means, and we never ran into any scenario where the power was dropping off after a little while. We have seen that happen on some of the Moza products in the past, for example. So that is one thing that I was looking out for, and one thing I'm happy to report wasn't an issue on this guy. We then have 4 buttons around the top of the wheelbase to switch between modes, adjust settings, and so forth. And a little color display here as well for telemetry and making adjustments to settings. Now, I'm not going to spend any time talking about that right now because we are going to jump over on the PC and I'll take you through exactly how all those settings work and what's available there a little bit later on in today's video. So we then also do have Thrustmaster's newer quick release design on the front here as well. So it has this little lever mechanism as we saw before. It is made of plastic, and we just basically open that up. That allows us to release the wheel, and you can see all the pins inside for delivering power and allowing data transmission between the wheel and the wheelbase. So the wheel that comes with it, of course, has the same style quick release, so you don't have to have any kind of adapter. It literally just slots in. You can see the 6 pogo pins here, which are spring loaded. It slots into place. You latch it down. There is a minimal flex in the system overall. I would say it's pretty much on par with Fanatec's QR Lite system in terms of overall flex, and I would rate it a little bit higher than Fanatec's older QR1 system, which in some regions is still shipping with those ready to race bundles. So just make sure that you check out the details of exactly what you're getting if you are looking at one of those bundles, as we were referencing a little bit earlier on. Now, if you're running one of the older style Thrustmaster wheels with the old style quick release, You can see these do have the old screw type with the PS2 style port. Those of you who are as old as me will remember those from when keyboards and mice used to connect using those connectors. These basically will require this kind of adapter here. So this shipped with our T598, I believe. So you will need to purchase this as an optional accessory if you're wanting to use one of the older wheels. And essentially what happens here is you screw this into the back of your wheel. So that goes on there like that. You screw this onto the back of the wheel, crank it down. I'm not going to do it up super tight now, and then you would connect it to the wheelbase in exactly the same manner. Now, obviously having plastic adapters within the system is going to add some additional flex and opportunity for things to break. So not a huge fan of that solution, but thankfully a lot of the newer wheels now do actually come with multiple style quick releases. So if you wanted to use them on the T598, you simply just swap out the back of the wheel to one of these guys and you are good to go with minimal flex. So yeah, I would say about on par with the QR2 Lite system. A little bit better than what you find with the older QR1, but not as good as what you find on Moza's ecosystem with their NRG style quick release. Now, when I say not as good as, the reason I say that is because, you know, you don't have to deal with mechanisms. It's just literally a collar that you pull to release those wheels. A little bit less flex in my experience, at least across the board with the Moza quick releases as well. But there's not enough flex here in the quick release to bother anybody, I don't think. So not a point of complaint. And I haven't seen any major complaints with this system in terms of longevity either, although of course that's not something that we've been able to test ourselves because we've only had our hands on this guy for about 2 weeks at this point. So then underneath the wheelbase, we have 4 mounting points here. I'll put some dimensions up on the screen for that as well. And it also comes with a angle bracket here. And that's going to allow you to bolt the wheelbase onto most sim rigs that are out there. We had absolutely no issues at all bolting this to our P1X Pro, just using the holes on the side here on either side. And there's minimal flex in that as well. Certainly nothing that I would be complaining about. For those of you who want to race on a table as well, you are covered. It does come included in the box with 2 of these table clamps. And these are extremely easy to mount up and do a good job. There is a little bit more flex than having it hard mounted, but look, chances are your table is going to be moving around more than the actual physical mounts do. So yeah, no complaints there either. It does the job absolutely fine. And I do like the fact that they are including the table mounts inside the box as well. That is definitely a nice touch. So flipping the base around now to have a look at the back, we've got another plastic cover on the back here. There is no ventilation in here, so it is just that heatsink assembly that we saw on the front before, responsible for cooling this. There's no cooling fans or anything like that, as you saw when we opened it up just before. And on the back here, we've got a few different ports here. We've got our power connector here, which I would say is a little bit on the flimsy side. I'll grab the other end of it here now quickly to show you. It's just this tiny little 3-prong power connection, which, you know, look, honestly, the first time you step on this cable, it is going to break the connector off. But look, it is what it is. If you're tripping over cables around behind your sim rig, chances are you're going to be breaking something anyway. What I would imagine would happen is that the little catch here would probably either snap or just release itself. And hopefully there wouldn't be any damage on the wheelbase. So not a major complaint, but just one little observation there. We then move across to the PS2 style port, which is for connecting things like handbrakes and shifters. We then got our pedal port here as well, which is like an RJ style connection. And obviously the pedals that come included in the bundle do connect directly to that. One other thing that should be mentioned there as well is if you have another set of Thrustmaster pedals that use this same style of connection, like the TLCM pedals, for example, you can use those with this wheelbase as well. And that is the case on both PC and PS5. Have absolutely no issues running them in either case. You will just need to set the base up to know which style of pedals you have connected, and then everything just works. We then got this what looks like RJ45 port here, which doesn't have any use at this stage. We are seeing quite a few bases come out these days with ports that are unused. So I'm assuming some sort of expansion in the future. It's probably CAN bus or something like that, I would imagine. And then a USB-C connection for connecting back to your PC. And it does come with a 2-meter long, nice high quality braided USB cable for connecting back to your PC or your PS5. So no complaints there whatsoever. That is a quick run through of the hardware of the wheelbase. And of course, we will be coming back a little bit later on once we've taken a look at the wheel and the pedals and running you through all the features and of course the driving experience. So let's take a more detailed look now at the sports car steering wheel included with the bundle and how it compares to the wheel included with the GT Pro from Fanatec. So 300mm diameter here as opposed to the 280mm diameter that we have with the GT Pro wheel. I actually prefer the slightly larger diameter. I feel that it's a little bit more versatile. One of the things that I absolutely love about this is the fact that it's a completely round wheel. Massive complaint that I have for any bundle that comes with a wheel shape other than completely round is that it does limit the versatility. You can imagine trying to drift or do rally driving with a wheel of this kind of style is just going to be inherently awkward compared to something completely round that you can slip through your hands. Now, you might have also noticed that the GT Pro wheel has 1 centering mark. Now, the sports car wheel has 4 of them. Now, It's a little bit of a strange design choice here. I feel like this is a bit of a marketing department type thing, but it doesn't make any sense to me why they would have 4 of these little rings here as opposed to just one in the top center. Yeah, a little bit strange there, but it is what it is. So those little red accents are aluminium. Everything else on the wheel, including all of the touch points, with the exception of just the shifter paddles on the back that we'll look at in just a moment, are all plastic. So this carbon fiber looking piece here is just a piece of plastic with a textured finish on it. And it does look quite convincing. Look, it doesn't look like genuine carbon fiber up close, but from a distance, it looks absolutely fine. The buttons themselves do have a relatively satisfying click to them, certainly nothing special, but I would say on par with the feeling of the buttons that we have on the GT Pro wheel in terms of the actual button press. You'll notice, of course, that the GT Pro wheel does have a little display on the wheel as opposed to the display on the base. Again, we will discuss that display and what it can do a little bit later on when we're up and driving. And then all of the rest of the wheel is plastic, just with the exception of these rubber grips here, which basically feel identical to what we have on the GT Pro. So there's absolutely no squish there at all. It is just a rubber wrapping around the plastic wheel underneath. Now, in terms of flex in the wheel itself, from side to side through the middle here, no major complaints whatsoever. Twisting it from the top to bottom, you will feel quite a bit of flex there, but look, it's not really something that you would ever be doing under normal driving circumstances anyway. So I don't think at this kind of price point, it's something that is likely to bother anybody. Where I do have a bit of a gripe with this wheel though, is just in the button configuration. Now you've got all the standard PlayStation buttons on here, and these are all mappable on PC. What they've done that's very different from the GT Pro wheels, you can see on the GT Pro, you've got 4 of these 5-way switches. So these have push button, left, right, up, and down, and you have 4 of them easily accessible there in each position. Now these correlate with settings inside GT7 specifically, but they are also mappable for other games as well. So in GT7, if you're familiar with that game, different colors will correlate with different settings, and those will vary depending on what style of car you're driving. So it might be ABS, engine map, traction control, and so forth. On this wheel, because you've got 4 physical buttons, you've got an easy way to make those adjustments very quickly. And particularly if you're driving in VR, you can feel your way around and just feel the buttons straight away. The way this works on this particular wheel is you've got a little light down here. And as you can see in the footage here, as we push the S button, it changes through various different pages. So the light will illuminate in these 4 different colors. And then these 3 buttons will change their functionality depending on the page that you're on. So in the blue setting, you can see minus correlates with 18, plus with 19, and P with 24. If we change that to another page, you can see now it's 20, 21, and 25, and so forth. So you can imagine if you're trying to drive in VR, obviously you're not going to be able to see the color of that LED, and that's going to make it impossible. So I definitely much prefer the functionality that we have with these 4 buttons as opposed to the system that we have on the Thrustmaster wheel. So just something to consider there, particularly if you're driving in VR. But even just, driving with a screen, having to fumble around through pages and try to change things while you're driving is very, very clumsy. So otherwise the functionality is pretty much identical. The only other difference being that you have your R3 and L3 buttons on the physical wheel with Fanatec, because their wheelbases only have a power button, whereas on the Thrustmaster system, you've got L3 and R3 awkwardly placed on the wheelbase, so you have to reach around the wheel to get to them. But that does have the advantage of if you're using a different wheel, you still have those buttons. But look, at the price point, I don't have any major complaints. Just to quickly cover off the shifters as well, these actually did quite impress me for the price. They've got a quite nice clicky feel to them. There is a bit of a rattle through the wheel, but a nice snap there. There's no sort of play or excessive flex there really whatsoever to speak of. And yeah, for the price, I'm happy with them. Just comparing them across to the GT Pro as well. These are plastic, as you can see. It's kind of glass infused plastic material, which is a little bit more rigid. Look, there's not a whole lot of difference between them. I'd have a tough time calling which one I preferred, to be honest with you. The Thrustmaster ones are a little bit more snappy. These ones have a bit more of a mechanical kind of feel, like they're connected to something physically. 6 of one, half a dozen of the other really there. I don't have a preference between the two of them. They're just a little bit different. And that covers off, I think, pretty much everything you need to know about the steering wheel. Extremely light as well, which is obviously a good thing. We want to reduce the amount of rotating mass we have on the wheelbase as much as possible for something that is around that kind of 5 Newton meter mark to try and maximize that responsiveness. So that covers off everything you need to know about the wheel and the base for now. Before we get into the software and driving experience, let's get the pedals up on the table now and take a quick look at those. So these are the pedals that are included in the bundle. Now, they might look quite familiar to you. Fanatec were the first to come out with a design like this, as far as I can recall at least, with their CSL pedals. Moza also followed suit with their SRP pedals as well. So basically what you have here is a base plate, and then you have 4 screws which secure each of the pedals in place, and you can move them from side to side to place the pedals however you want. Now, the first thing that jumped out at me about these pedals is just how narrow this base plate is. So 10.5 inches or just under 27 centimeters wide. And there is going to be a load cell and a clutch upgrade available for these pedals. Now, I don't have a whole lot of detail on exactly what that's going to look like just yet, but I can imagine, and I'm sure you guys can picture as well, if you were to put a brake pedal in the middle here and then have a clutch on the side, it's going to be extremely cramped. So not something that I can comment on at this point really, because I haven't actually driven with it, but I think that may end up being quite a struggle, particularly with such large pedal faces. So maybe they'll include some skinnier pedal faces with some of those upgrade kits. That's something that we'll definitely keep an eye out on in the future. But look, in terms of the actual physical design, all metal design here pretty much throughout. They are using Hall effect sensors for both of these pedals. As I said before, there will be a load cell brake upgrade available in the future. So flipping the pedals around here, you can see the electronics are all internal. There's no wiring or anything floating around underneath here. You've got two little 3.5mm jacks on either side, like a headphone jack on your non-iPhone. And yeah, basically each pedal plugs into each side of that, and then it runs back to the RJ connection that plugs into the back of your bass, as you saw before. So relatively clean wiring there. There is no USB port on these pedals, so you're not going to be connecting to your PC or anything else externally. They are only designed for usage with a Thrustmaster wheelbase that has that RJ connection that we looked at before. Now, flipping the pedals around on the back here, you can see some of the mechanism here. So as I said before, they are Hall effect sensors on both sides. That means that there's no mechanical moving parts that can wear and tear or take on dirt and debris over time, so they should stay nice and reliable. And on the back here, you can see a few adjustments. So the throttle does only come with one spring here. You can see as we push it in and out, you can see we've got a shaft that runs through the sleeve here, nice and smooth. There's no play or flex or any sort of slop there whatsoever. A very nice, smooth, linear action there as well. And if you do want to increase the preload on this pedal or decrease it, at the moment you can see we've actually got it on the stiffest setting. What you can do is you can move it into the second position or the third position, and that will reduce the amount of preload on the spring to make it feel a little bit softer for that initial pedal press, depending on your preference. Now, for the brake pedal, we have a similar adjustment. It actually comes with two springs. This is the stiffer spring of the two. So with the shorter and stiffer spring here, you have two settings available, hard or medium. With the softer spring installed, you can go soft, medium, or hard on the adjustment setting here. So 5 different settings available in total. Now, the thing that I think they've absolutely nailed about this brake pedal, and I don't say that lightly, is that it does still give you quite a lot of feel through the pedal. You can modulate your brake inputs quite accurately. It does have that clearly defined threshold point in the throw that you guys have heard me referencing in a lot of pedal reviews over the years here at Boosted Media. So as you push the pedal down, you can see the spring compresses initially, and then you've got this little elastomer behind it which will start to compress second. So what that means is when you push the pedal down, you get to your threshold point, and then you can modulate around that threshold point with the give that you get from the elastomer here. So even though it is a Hall effect sensor pedal, not a load cell, so therefore it is position-based rather than force-based, it does still give you a lot of mechanical feel, and I was actually able to adapt to this quite quickly. Now, I'm sure a lot of people will still ultimately want to upgrade to a load cell brake, and that's absolutely fine. But if you're just after something that gets you up and driving nice and conveniently, then I think this does the job well. And the other aspect to this as well is that, you know, a lot of the more high-end pedals are great and well and good, but if you want to run them on the floor, you're going to end up with the pedals tipping up under your feet or sliding across the floor. And that can be a really bad experience, of course, because you need to have precision and repeatability in your brake inputs. So these pedals are just in that sweet spot. They actually do include some little carpet spikes as well, which literally just clip into the back of the pedals. And that allows you to run the pedals on the carpet with absolutely no issues. So in terms of a versatile design, a one-size-fits-all product that you can start off with without a rig and then ultimately move across to a sim rig later on, I think they've done a really good job here. The one very minor complaint that I have is that the mounting holes are screw-in type with threads on the bottom. So if you're wanting to mount them on an aluminium profile rig, that is quite awkward because you obviously can't get underneath it on profile to screw in. But a lot of sim rigs do have provision for this kind of thing. Then you just have 8mm holes on the back here that you can screw into. But yeah, as I said before, absolutely no issues with slop or flex or anything like that. You can move the pedal pads up and down as well to accommodate for different foot sizes. And yeah, for what they are, I actually think they've done a really good job of these pedals. They did surprise and over deliver rather than disappoint. So yeah, no complaints there. I think that is everything we need to cover in terms of top level hardware stuff. Let's jump over onto the sim rig now, take you through software and configuration on the base, and then we'll get stuck into the driving experience. So let's have a little bit more of a chat now about this display on the Wheelbase. Now this serves a very similar purpose and has similar functionality to what you might be used to from the Fanatec ecosystem. Big difference here being that in this instance, as you can see, the display is on the Wheelbase, whereas in Fanatec's ecosystem, at least outside of the DD1 and DD2, the displays are found on the wheels themselves. Now that does have the advantage, of course, of never having the potential to be blocked. So you can imagine if you had a steering wheel that just happened to have a piece that was covering that display, you're going to be out of luck here. Of course, on the flip side, it does mean that the wheels can be cheaper because they don't have to have displays built into them themselves. So advantages and disadvantages, of course, to both approaches. So we've got 4 buttons across the top of the Wheelbase here. Those are quite awkward to reach when you're driving, but not really intended to be something that you're going to be touching regularly anyway. So not really a major complaint there. So if we press the mode button, that takes us into our compatibility menu. Now I did notice that when I switched over to PlayStation, it did automatically jump into PlayStation mode. When I went back to PC again, it did automatically jump into PC mode. So that's a nice little touch there. Other bases that I've tested in the past, you have to physically change it every single time. So that was quite convenient. We do have the option here to manually change between modes too. So we've got a PC mode, we've got PlayStation mode, and then PlayStation mode too. So just check the game that you're playing and the platform that you're playing on to make sure that you're in the correct mode for the best experience. And that is a quick rundown on the different modes there. So let's push on the cog button here on the left-hand side. This brings us into our main menu. We can choose between the settings menu by pressing L3 or our telemetry menu by pressing R3. So let's go ahead and press R3 for now. This takes us into our telemetry menu. So from here, we can choose which telemetry we want to have displayed on the screen in front of us. Now there are some limitations here in terms of compatibility. So just check the compatibility chart on the Thrustmaster website. I'll put a link in the description down below for all this information, just to make sure that the telemetry that you want to display is going to work with the particular game that you're wanting to play. But just to give you a rundown on the various different telemetry data that is available here, we've got gear, which is the currently selected gear. We've got speed, pretty self-explanatory. We've got current position. We've got our current lap number. We've got our best lap time. We've got our current RPM. And then we've got the ability to choose between a GT or Formula style display as well. So there is an integrated RPM strip on the top of the display as well, as you can see in this driving footage now. And that allows us to choose whether we want to have it to go from left to right or from the sides to the middle, depending on the type of car that we're driving. So we can just scroll up and down to choose between GT or Formula. I'm going to leave it on GT for now, and I'm going to leave it on current gear for now. We then just push our cog button again, and that takes us back to the main display. Once we're inside the game, of course, that telemetry would be displayed. So you can see it probably is going to be something that you're going to set and forget at least for one race, not something that you're likely to be going in and changing while you're driving. Although you can do it, it is possible here. You're not having to actually go into any other software or alt tab out of your game to make those adjustments. Now, on that subject, we do also need to talk about software integration. Now, at the time that we're filming this, you can't actually change any of the settings pertaining to the force feedback on the software, which isn't really a major issue because you can do it all through the Wheelbase. But just to give you a quick look at what this software looks like, it is pretty primitive at this point in time. Basically, it just lists the various different peripherals that are connected. You click on them. You've got a basic overview, which tells you your version number. Make sure that everything is nice and healthy. It gives you a serial number as well. We've then got settings here, which you can see is currently grayed out. So no ability to make any adjustments to force feedback on the PC. What you can do though is change between presets by clicking D1, 2, and 3. So testing is the page that you guys already saw, and then links is literally just links across to support and thrustmaster.com. So very, very basic software at this point in time. Interested to see how they potentially flesh that out. So to make adjustments to our force feedback characteristics, the process is exactly the same regardless of whether you're on console or PC. So we press on the cog again, and we press on L3 to access our settings menu. And you can see the first thing that pops up is the current firmware version. Not really sure why they would choose to make that first in the menu, because it's the thing that you're least likely to need to look at. So a little bit strange there. I'm sure they'll fix that up at some point. But if we scroll through here by using the up and down buttons, you can see that allows us to go up and down through the menu, and then pressing right and left allows us to manipulate the settings. So you can see here on the firmware menu, it gives us the base firmware version, the wheel firmware version, and the pedals. And then it gives us the ability to factory reset if we need to do so as well. So if we scroll down here, now we have our force feedback profile. So D stands for default, and basically out of the box, these profiles go from the tamest to the most aggressive as we go through. Profiles 1, 2, and 3 can be customized. D is just a cooked in profile, and there is a chart available on the website once again that takes you through all the various different values for each one of these profiles by default if you do want to go back. I believe factory reset also resets these back to their defaults as well. So if we go into profile number 3 here, which is the one that I've already customized, we can go down. And this is where we start to get into settings that are actually going to have an impact on what we feel through the steering wheel. So we've got a master adjustment here, which is our main adjustment for the strength of the force feedback. And obviously you can wind this up between 0 and 100%. It does go in 5% increments here, so you don't have super granular adjustment. The next setting is our mode. So we have beginner, sport, performance, and extreme. This is essentially kind of just taming down the amount of detail and the reactiveness, responsiveness of the force feedback for those who might not be ready for the most extreme settings. So if you've got young kids, this is probably where you're going to want to start them and then step them up over time. We're just going to leave this on E for now, and we scroll down, we go into the friction setting. So this allows us to adjust how much friction we actually feel, the sensation of the wheel being physically connected to something inside the car. Now, most games do their own friction. So this is kind of like a filter that sits over the top of the data that's coming out of the game. Now, we'll get into this in more detail when we get into the driving experience in just a moment, but I do actually recommend that you leave this friction set to low if you're on PlayStation, simply because there are some weird oscillation issues that happen even when you're just sitting in the menu, which can actually make the wheel quite dangerous. And I'll show you that when we get into the driving experience. But I am on PC right now, so I'm going to set that back to off. So moving on from friction, we then have adjustments for boost low and boost high. Now these are essentially a linearity adjustment for the response of the force feedback. So you can imagine only having 5 Newton meters of dynamic range available here. There could be scenarios where if you crank up the force feedback high enough to feel the detail in the weaker forces like curbs and road textures, you might end up clipping in the higher end. Conversely, if you're finding, if maybe you've got a younger child using the rig, for example, and they're finding that the crash forces or those strong forces are too powerful, if you wind the entire strength of the wheelbase down, then those finer details like road textures, for example, aren't going to be so noticeable. So what this allows us to do is adjust the linearity here. So boost low, as they describe it in their literature, is impacting the light to medium forces, so things like rumble strips and edge of track road textures, for example. And we have the adjustment range here from -2 to +2. So if we're finding that the overall master adjustment that we have here just isn't bringing out enough detail in those finer textures, then we can crank that up accordingly. And likewise, if we go down to boost high, as they describe it, this is adjusting the medium to high forces. So it describes it as things like collisions with another vehicle or a wall, for example. So if you're finding that you're clipping, for example, you might want to decrease this, or if you're finding that the effects just aren't quite strong enough for you, you can wind it up here as well. But of course, you will just want to make sure that you're not introducing any clipping. Now, if you're wondering what clipping is, to put it as simply as possible, essentially it's when the signal that you're sending the wheelbase exceeds the wheelbase's ability to actually produce that detail. So what it ends up doing is it just ends up cutting it off at the top, similar to distortion in a speaker, for example. So rather than feeling fine detail through the wheel, it just ends up sending a constant signal. So you can imagine if you're going around a corner, you might suddenly feel that the response in the force feedback just doesn't change. It just kind of sits exactly the same. That would be an example of clipping. If you want to know more detail on that, let me know in the comments down below. We might actually do a separate video where we dig into that in a lot more detail for you if that's something that you're interested in. But for now, I'm just going to leave both of those on 0. There are recommended settings from Thrustmaster for various different titles. One thing that I thought was a little bit interesting is a lot of their recommended settings actually say to set both of these to +2. And I thought that was a little bit strange because it's basically the same as just cranking everything up on an equalizer on a sound system. You basically just end up increasing the gain across the entire dynamic range, and you kind of just end up where you started again. So a little bit odd there, but it is what it is. So next we have our damper setting. So this is essentially just damping down the force feedback detail. So if you're finding that it feels a little bit grainy or a little bit too kind of robotic, for example, then you could wind up a little bit more damper to counteract that and make the wheel feel smoother overall. Now, the characteristics of this motor are such that there's not a lot of robotic feel anyway. So what I would recommend and what Thrustmaster also recommend is that you keep this relatively low. I never found a scenario, regardless of what type of driving I was doing, where I wanted to run this more than 10. Most times I was running it at 0. So that's where I'm going to leave it right now. So next up, we have our adjustment for spring or centering spring. So most modern games these days return the wheel to center on their own anyway. So this is a setting that's basically just reserved for games that don't have any force feedback. So this is an adjustment purely just from 0 to 100%. Obviously, the higher you go, the more aggressive the centering force. Most of us are just going to be leaving this set to 0. And then we have gear jolt. Now this is quite interesting. It actually sends a artificial jolt or an effect through the wheelbase to simulate gear changes. And because of the nature of this motor, it actually sends the jolt right through the cockpit. So you actually feel it in the seat of your pants, obviously depending on the type of rig that you're driving with and how high you have this cranked up. But we've got the adjustment here between off, low, medium, and high. And I actually like leaving this on high. I found that I really missed it if I switched it off again. So quite a cool little setting there. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into driving experience experience in just a moment. And then end stop, this is purely just how the artificial end stop feels when you reach the limit of travel in the steering rack. So being a direct drive motor, there isn't actually a physical hard stop here. So this is essentially just simulating that. We've got adjustment here between low, medium, and high, depending on how you want that end stop to feel. And that is it for force feedback settings. So there's not a whole lot of adjustment here. Now, what I will say is a lot of these settings don't have an absolutely massive impact on the way the force feedback feels, at least not compared to a lot of other direct drive wheelbases on the market these days. Most of what we're feeling in terms of the driving experience is relating more to the motor's characteristics and the firmware itself, how it's actually interpreting the force feedback data rather than being modified by these settings. But on that note, let's get in now and talk about what this thing is actually like to drive with. Okay, so by now you should have a good understanding of what this product's all about and some of the things that make it unique. What I want to do now is spend a bit of time unpacking the experience of actually owning and living with one of these things and what it's like to drive with. So we're going to split this up into a couple of different sections just to make sure that we cover off all the various different points that I think are important to you guys. We're going to start off with force feedback because I think that's what's going to be most interesting to people. We'll then talk a little bit about ergonomics and general usability. We'll talk about the integrated dash and of course the quick release and wider ecosystem as well. And then we'll move on into the pedals, talk about all the details around that, and then I'll wrap things up with some comparisons with other products that I think might be of interest if you're in this kind of ballpark budget-wise. So let's start off with force feedback here, and I thought the best way to do this would be to actually go on Thrustmaster's website and kind of pick apart some of their claims, because as we looked at earlier on, they have been making some very, very bold claims around this new direct axial drive technology. So when you jump on the T598 webpage, the first thing you see is drive into a new era of sim racing. Now, look, this is just simply not the case. Look, it is a very good direct drive wheelbase, but it doesn't feel massively different from any other direct drive base at around this kind of price point. There are some things that I think it does a little bit better. There are some aspects of it that I think are a little bit worse than some of the competitors as well. But it's not like this thing is absolutely revolutionary and going to transform the experience of sim racing. So I definitely feel like that is a little bit over the top. Now, we are going to unpack what I mean when I say it does some things better and some things not as well. But let's just go through this in a little bit more detail first. So feel racing sensations like never before with the T598 and its direct axial drive motor, the new generation of direct drive. The motor allows for perfect clear wheel rim motion with no cogging and for high fidelity force feedback. Now, perfect is a very, very strong word. One of the first things that I noticed with this setup as soon as I turned it on, before I even jumped into a game, is that any time that the wheel is stationary, so not being moved from side to side, there's a weird kind of vibration that gets transferred through the shaft, and you feel it in your hands on the wheel. So it's basically any time the wheel's being held in a still position, but as soon as you actually start moving it, that sensation, for the most part, completely disappears. So I actually got in touch with them straight away and said, look, I just want to make sure that what I'm feeling here is normal and it's not an issue with my particular base. And their response was, I'll give you the question and the response. So I said, as we get through testing the T598, I'm noticing a slight hum in the motor, which transfers as a very noticeable vibration anytime that it's stationary. It goes away again the moment you move the wheel, but as soon as you stop moving it, it comes back. Is this expected behavior? Seems like perhaps it's just a characteristic of the axial flux motor trying to hold itself in one position, but I thought it was best to ask. And their response was, I can confirm it's normal. It's because the direct axial drive has no cogging at all, so no friction. You can feel a subtle vibration when you're not driving. So that to me, unfortunately, makes that seem like at least it's just a characteristic of the motor. Perhaps it's something that they'll be able to tune out in future firmware updates, but you know, we have to review what we have in front of us, and at this point in time, that is something that is very noticeable and not present on other wheelbases. Now, other wheelbases around this price point do have their little quirks as well. A lot of them can feel quite notchy around center. A lot of them do have quite profound torque ripple and cogging as you rotate the wheel. We'll get into that in just a moment as well. But he also added on in his response, another example is on GT7. The game has a natural spring which we can't turn off in the menu. The steering wheel can then oscillate because there's no friction to counter the spring. You can reduce this by adding friction on the T598 force feedback menu, but it'll also lower some of the effect. This is part of the game optimization we are currently working on. So this is something that I think is really important. I found that even after I exited out of the game and I was just sitting in the PlayStation menu, if the wheel's completely stationary and you hold it in that position, it will sit there and it's absolutely fine. I want to also reiterate that this only happens in PlayStation mode. It doesn't happen in PC mode. So if you're playing on PC, this isn't a concern to you, but on PlayStation, even if you just move the wheel ever so slightly, as you can see here, it begins to oscillate. And then what happens is it overshoots in each direction. So it goes a little bit further each time and then corrects itself. And that's what creates this oscillation. And that oscillation with the overshoot feature that we'll be talking about in just a moment gets so strong that it can actually hurt you. And you can see here I actually recorded myself deliberately putting my hand into the wheel, and you can see how it's bashing into my fingers. Now look, realistically for an adult, I do think that it's strong enough to hurt you. If you were to put your pinky through the wheel or something like that, it probably would actually, injure or maybe even break your pinky finger. But if you're considering buying one of these for young children to use, look, I'll say it this way. I was actually planning on putting this on my son's rig to give him an upgrade from the G27 that he normally drives with. I'm now not going to be doing that because I actually think that this is dangerous. If he was to put his arm through the wheel or try to touch the wheel while it's oscillating like this, it would actually probably break one of his fingers. So I think that's something that they really need to focus on fixing ASAP. Now look, their response was basically saying that it's an issue with the game implementation and they have to fix it that way. But look, a lot of other direct drive wheelbases, in fact, most other direct drive wheelbases have a hands-off protection mode where if it detects that there's no input coming back into the shaft, no torque on the shaft, then it will just cut off force feedback entirely. I feel like that's something that they need to implement very urgently because I think it is a genuine safety risk. So those are the two more major quirks that I found with relation to the force feedback on this wheel. Let's scroll down on the page now and have a look at some of their other key call out features here. So direct axial drive motor, unique zero cogging technology. Now, look, I will agree with this. The cogging on this thing is literally non-existent. Other than that rippling that you feel whenever the wheel is stationary, which actually annoys me more than cogging on some other direct drive wheelbases, to be honest with you. But look, the actual movement in the wheel, to put it clearly, every other direct drive wheelbase at this kind of price point has at least some level of torque ripple or cogging. What I mean by that is basically the interaction between the coils and the magnets in the motor is always going to have little steps in it. So as the stator rotates past each magnet, it's going to want to kind of try and snap into the next position. And there's all kinds of funky things that people do with firmware to counteract that to the maximum possible extent. But this thing, because of its design, is literally completely smooth in its rotation. There is no sensation of any kind of torque ripple or anything like that at all. Now, look, in the driving experience with most direct drive wheelbases, it's not typically something that you notice when you're driving anyway. But I will go as far as to say that in motion, at least, this is the smoothest direct drive wheelbase sat at anywhere near this kind of price point. So they've definitely done a very good job there, but there is that underpinning vibration anytime the wheel is stationary, which at this stage, we don't know if it's something they're going to be able to fix through firmware. So that's my comments around this zero cogging technology. 5 Newton meter plus overshoot, constant torque with super boosted effects. So this is a bit of an interesting one. What they mean by this is that the wheelbase is able to maintain a constant 5 Newton meters of torque for sustained cornering forces and things like that. And then it's able to actually overshoot that as well. Now, look, unfortunately, there isn't really a standardized methodology around how wheelbase manufacturers quote their Newton meters of torque. So some will be quoting their peak torque or the torque that they're able to achieve for a little while, whereas some will be quoting their continuous torque. What I will say is that this definitely feels on the stronger side for a 5 Newton meter wheelbase. I would say this actually feels closer in the driving experience to the CSL DD with the boost kit than it does to, say, the Moza R5, for example. But the way it's actually achieving that perception is quite interesting. So what it does is it actually uses some of the inertia in the movement to its advantage to overshoot the force feedback even further than it would otherwise be able to do. And because the motor is so responsive, it's able to do that. So that does add for the driver the perception of additional strength, but it's only under certain circumstances. So say, for example, you're bumping into another car or you're quickly changing direction, you do feel that the wheel feels stronger, but it also feels a little bit artificial under some circumstances because it's a non-linear response. What I mean by that is, say for example, one thing that I noticed straight away was when I was warming up my tires on the formation lap, when I'm weaving from side to side, the car feels unrealistically heavy as you change direction because of that overshoot, but then it kind of softens down again. So, it's kind of one of those things where some people might absolutely love it. Personally, I prefer to have a more realistic, more linear kind of response in my force feedback because it gives a better sense of what the car's actually doing underneath you. But if you're the sort of person that really feels like you want to be fighting against the car and really get that engaging experience, then this probably does a better job of that than any other wheelbase at this kind of price point. So it really is just going to come down to what you value in the sim racing experience overall. But I think, overall it is a great feature that they've done a really good job of. The implementation is actually really clever when you consider, how complex something like this is to achieve. achieve, but it certainly does come with some compromises. Now, the next point here that they mention is harmony, which is high frequency vibration technology. Now, this works in a similar kind of way to what we were just talking about with overshoot, but it uses the resonance inherent inside the motor to basically amplify some of the effects that you're feeling. So what that means is that with certain high frequency effects, it can actually use the internal resonance of the motor to amplify that. And a very basic analogy for this is it's kind of like jumping on a trampoline. Every time you jump, you're able to go a little bit higher than the jump before. It's kind of like that. Every time there's a cycle in the resonance, it's able to amplify that just a little bit further. Now look, in practice, because of the implementation of the force feedback here and some of the effects, I don't really find this to be all of that remarkable, simply because there are some optimization issues that I experienced, particularly on the console side of things with the force feedback on this wheel. And what I mean by that is that it's quite inconsistent. Sometimes you'll go up over a curb and you just don't feel any sort of sensation of the ripples in the curb at all. Some areas of the track will feel like they have a lot of vibration, a lot of texture in them. Other areas will feel completely dull and no texture at all. Driving out onto the grass in a lot of scenarios as well, you just don't feel any sensation, but then in other scenarios you feel it a lot. So there is quite a bit of inconsistency there in the implementation of the force feedback. Now, obviously it will depend on the game that you're playing. iRacing in particular is notorious for this because certain tracks are laser scanned and certain tracks aren't. So there can be a lot of inconsistency just inherent in the games that you're playing as well. But comparing the experience driving on the same tracks with the same cars with other wheelbases, I did find that it was more inconsistent with this wheelbase than certain others. I think the Fanatec CSL DD is probably the standout one within this kind of price point for consistency of force feedback across different sim racing titles. So yeah, this is all stuff that hopefully they'll be able to refine over time, but I do very much feel like direct drive technology in general is kind of at a point now where it's more advanced than the sim racing titles that are driving the force feedback in the first place. So it really has kind of become a scenario of, if you've got garbage coming in, then you're gonna have garbage coming out, and it's really as simple as that. So look, this harmony thing, again, like, it sounds really cool, and there are some circumstances where it does genuinely make a difference and it is noticeable. But I think for this to really come into its own, the force feedback in general just needs to be more consistent. And I know they are putting a lot of effort into the implementation for Assetto Corsa Evo. So hopefully that'll be a real game changer, and we'll really sort of see this base come alive. And it'll be really interesting to compare the experience on this base to a lot of others around this price point once that game does release. That's definitely going to be something that we'll check out. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on that. So just to finish up on force feedback here, let's jump quickly back onto their website and go through a couple more of their points here. So under the hood, direct axial drive motor. With an axial flux motor, direct axial drive is the next generation direct drive motor for sim racing. We've already talked about that claim, allowing for perfect, very strong word, once again, clear wheel rim motion with no cogging. We talked about that. That's, I would say, I agree with, other than that vibration. The result, high fidelity force feedback and clearer effects. Feel every detail instantly with greater precision and intensity. Okay, let's unpack this. So the effects that are there, I think, do feel a little bit more detailed and a little bit more refined than some other direct drive wheelbases around this price point. But I wouldn't necessarily say that it feels more realistic overall. One of the characteristics that I noticed in the force feedback here across both console and PC, and I'm going to talk about the differences between the two in just a moment because there is some profound differences there as well. But the characteristic that I noticed compared to, say, the Fanatec CSL DD, for example, is that even though the really fine granular detail feels a little bit more detailed than it does on pretty much anything else that I've ever driven with at this price point, the actual sensation of weight in the car and being connected to the steering rack was maybe a little bit lacking, particularly in some titles compared to the experience on some other competitors. So what I mean by that is, say for example, when you're driving up on a curb and the car is kind of really throwing you, if you're going around a left-hand turn, throwing you to the right, you don't feel that sensation of weight or suspension geometry so profoundly in this wheelbase as you do on other competitors. Particularly the CSL DD, I would say. It's much more similar to the Moza R3 and Moza R5 in that regard, or even the Moza R9. So I feel like the focus has very much been on the texture and detail rather than the suspension geometry and tire interface, if that makes sense. But unfortunately, even though that granular detail is really important for giving you an immersive experience, as a sim racer, what you actually need to feel is what the car's doing in relation to the road. And that is where I feel like things were lacking a little bit. Now, look, the wheel is very responsive and snappy. It is very easy to catch slides very quickly. I would say that I was able to catch some slides that I wasn't able to catch with other direct drive wheelbases around this price point. But when I was trying to eke out those last few tenths around a lap, I just didn't feel as connected to the car with this wheelbase as I did with others. And that was a consistent sensation across all the various different sim racing titles on both console and PC. So I definitely feel like that's something that they can refine into the future. I don't think that that's a characteristic of the hardware. It's purely just the implementation of the force feedback. And I'm sure that's something that can refine over time. And I think it's also important to note here that I did experiment with the settings extensively here. I've spent a good number of weeks now and probably, 10, 15 hours driving with this thing, just trying to, really get to understand its characteristics and its details, as well as using their recommended settings to make sure that I wasn't missing anything as well. So yeah, I think that gives you a good picture of the overall experience of what it's like to drive one of these things across the board. But let's unpack it a little bit more now and talk about some of the differences between console and PC. Now look, on console in general, every single wheelbase that we've ever tested, from the most basic entry level all the way through to super high-end stuff, the quality of the force feedback, the detail, the sensation of connectedness to the car, all those things that I was discussing just before aren't as profound on console as they are on PC. It's just the way it is. It's the way the force feedback works. And look, what I would say here is that the difference between this and other competitors on console is much less profound. I think that at the end of the day, whatever you buy at around this kind of price point, you're probably going to be happy with on console. It's really when you jump over onto PC that you really start to notice some of these subtle things. Now, that said, I know they are working a lot on refining the experience, particularly in GT7 at the moment. So it is certainly possible that we might see some big leaps forward there. Now, one very important consideration on PlayStation specifically is that the force feedback quality in Assetto Corsa Competizione is absolutely terrible. Now, it just feels completely disconnected, and yeah, it's just a really bad experience. Now, I have spoken to Thrustmaster about this. They have acknowledged the problem. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like there's ever going to be a fix for this title specifically, simply because Kunos, the developer of Assetto Corsa Competizione, are focusing all their efforts on Assetto Corsa Evo at this point in time. So if Assetto Corsa Competizione on PlayStation is your go-to sim, you probably want to avoid this product. So I think that covers off force feedback pretty extensively there. We do have to remember that this is a brand new product. Look, I remember when the DD1 and DD2 came out from Fanatec, they were an absolute mess for at least a year before they really refined things down. And the experience initially compared to the experience that you have now on those wheelbases is completely different. So look, it is early days for the T598. And look, I think that there is a lot of untapped potential in this wheelbase that will come to fruition over time as they refine their drivers and their firmware. But I can only review what I have in front of me right now, and that has been the experience. So let's move on now and talk about the ergonomics of the system overall. Now look, in terms of the steering wheel that they included in the bundle, I'm actually really happy with it. For the price, I think that they've done a good job here. Look, all the buttons are easily reachable. As you can see here, I can rotate my thumbs around and push those buttons with relative ease. Look, the quality of the buttons themselves isn't fantastic, as we covered off before. We don't need to go through that again, but it is a cheap wheel. It's not pretending to be high end. I was actually quite impressed with the feeling of the shifters for a wheel of this kind of price point. They do have a nice quality snap to them. There's no excessive flex there. There's no play or slop or anything like that. Definitely some of the better quality shifters that I've felt at around this price. And I do really like the fact that it's a round wheel as well. That does make it nice and versatile, easy to slip through your hands for things like drifting and rally driving, but equally just as okay for driving things like Formula style cars if you want to do that as well. Now, other than the weird decision to put 4 of these red rings on here rather than just one as a center line in the middle of the wheel, which I have no idea what they were thinking there. The only other complaint that I have really is just that these buttons are awkward to use. They're completely unusable if you're driving in VR because you're not going to be able to see which page you're on, but it's just very clumsy as opposed to having 4 little toggle switches like what we see on the GTDD Pro wheel, for example, from Fanatec. I think that's just a better implementation overall, although I do actually prefer the look of this wheel. It's much cleaner design overall, and the textured plastic that we have here, the faux carbon fiber, does actually look quite genuine. But yeah, overall I think they've done a pretty good job. There's no excessive flex there if you're holding the wheel the way you normally would from side to side in the center. A little bit of flex in the quick release, not a whole lot in the wheel. If you twist the wheel up and down, there is quite a bit there, as you can see, but you're not really going to be doing that when you're driving anyway. It's certainly not enough flex here that it was something that was noticeable when driving at all, which certainly can't be said for some other systems at around this kind of price point, particularly if you're looking at a CSL DD bundle from Fanatec. In Australia, at the time that we're making this video, they are still shipping with the QR1 quick release, although in other regions they have upgraded that to the QR2. So this is definitely a better experience than the QR1 quick release, but probably I would say on par, if maybe a little bit behind what you get with the QR2. but Moza definitely have the upper hand here with the quality of their quick release. But let's just quickly go back to ergonomics again as it relates to the Wheelbase. Now, a couple of major considerations here. I wouldn't say complaints, but definitely things that you need to consider. Not only the awkward placement of the buttons here, where you have to kind of reach around the wheel to get to them. Not that they're buttons that you're going to be using regularly anyway, but the size and shape of this thing is just awkward. It is going to mean that if you like to have your monitor nice and low to kind of match the dash up with the position of the steering wheel, you're not going to be able to do that in a lot of cases. It's either going to have to be tucked behind, or you know, if you've got a monitor that's thin enough, you might be able to slip it in between the two, but then of course you're not going to be able to access the buttons and the display. Now, if you're upgrading from a cog or belt-driven wheelbase, you know, chances are you've got something that's big and bulky anyway. But comparing this to something like the R3, R5, R9, or even the R12 from Moza, or the CSL DD or GT DD Pro, this is an awkward form factor that you are just going to have to consider. So I think that's everything you need to know in relation to the wheel and base. Let's have a little bit of a chat about these pedals and the driving experience there now. And look, honestly, this was something that really surprised me. I do have my reservations about adding on a clutch pedal later on, because the pedal set is so narrow, as we talked about earlier. But look, otherwise, the driving experience is actually really good for a pedal set of this kind of price point. I'd be interested to see what they do with a load cell upgrade kit later on, but I would say that this is the best pedal set that I've used in a bundle at this kind of price point. And I don't say that lightly, but the throttle pedal is very smooth and linear. No complaints there. There's no slop or movement or any slack or anything like that. There is plenty of adjustability there too, in terms of preload with those 3 different settings that we looked at before. And the brake pedal, for a non-load cell pedal that is position-based rather than force-based, it actually does a really good job. There is a clearly defined threshold point there that you can modulate your braking around. And look, honestly, I was able to adapt to it very quickly. And when you consider what they're trying to achieve with this pedal set, they really need this to be a one-size-fits-all kind of solution. You know, whether you've got it bolted to a rig like what we have here, or using it on the carpet, it just works. And that is certainly not an easy thing to achieve. A lot of pedal sets are absolutely great when they're bolted to a sim rig, but if you just want to use them on the floor underneath a table or something like that, they're going to slide all over the place and just be impossible to drive with. This genuinely does provide a good driving experience, even if you don't have a rig to bolt it to. So I think they've done a really good job here at nailing what they needed to for a pedal set for this point in the market. So yeah, good job there. Definitely some limitations there with regards to the wider ecosystem. I'm not a big fan of their TLCM pedals, which are, at least at this point in time, the highest end pedal set that they have available. Fanatec CSL Elite V2 pedals are, in my opinion, a lot better than anything that Thrustmaster has available at the moment. So if you are knowing that you're wanting to upgrade and you know, not run with the pedals that come in the bundle, then it is worth considering what options you do have available. Obviously on PC you can run any pedals that you want, but if you are looking at something for PlayStation, then you are going to have to stay within that ecosystem. So that is definitely an important consideration. But yeah, we'll see what they do in terms of a load cell upgrade and clutch upgrade. But for what we have here in front of us right now, yeah, I don't have any major complaints. I think they've done a really good job. So look, we've been through an awful lot of detail in this video, and I really hope that it's given you a better picture overall objectively of, you know, what's going to suit your needs best, and, you know, where this kind of fits in terms of the wider market. But look, to summarize the experience overall, it is pretty simple. I feel like the marketing that we've seen around this product, as is often the case from these bigger brands, is overly embellished. I don't think that it's the revolution in sim racing that they're making it out to be. That said, I do think that there is some untapped potential here. I think that this probably isn't the last that we've seen of this new Direct Axial Drive technology. I wouldn't be at all surprised if this was the direction that Direct Drive technology ultimately takes. And I have spoken to a few other manufacturers over the years that I know have experimented with this, but you know, these guys are the first that have brought it to market. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens there. But yeah, look, definitely not the revolution that it is being talked up to be. But that said, it does provide a very good experience overall. There are some things that I think it does better than anything else at this price point, particularly the smoothness overall, other than that vibration when the wheel is stationary. But you know, there are some quirks, as we discussed as well. So it'll be really interesting to see how they refine things over time. But look, when you boil it down, if you're upgrading to this from any belt-driven or cog-driven wheelbase, you're going to be absolutely blown away with it. You're going to think it's absolutely amazing. And look, for the price point, I do think that they've done a very good job here. So at the end of the day, my recommendation is this. If you're buying for PlayStation specifically, or you want something that is PlayStation compatible, then I think that this is probably the best value for money deal available on the market at this point in time. It is significantly cheaper than Fanatec's GT DD Pro bundle, which is really the only other natively compatible option at this kind of segment in the market. So yeah, I would buy this if I was looking to buy something specifically for PlayStation. This of course does come with that one caveat of the force feedback being absolutely broken in Assetto Corsa Competizione. If I was buying for PC specifically, then I think I probably would still go in the direction of the CSL DD from Fanatec. Now, there are a bunch of ready-to-race bundles available. You can check out our reviews and buyer's guide link down below for more details on this. But if you jump on the Fanatec website quickly, you'll see there are a bunch of bundles that start at around the same kind of price point as this for 5 Newton meter, and then step up from there depending on the wheel that you want. One thing just to be aware of there is that those ready-to-race bundles for the CSL DD don't come with a table clamp included. So if you do need that table clamp, that is going to be an additional cost. If you're looking at Moza, for example, then that table clamp is included with those. So yeah, for PC as it stands right now, that would be my recommendation. But for PlayStation, yeah, I think it's really hard to go past this. I think it is a very, very good value for money bundle. There is a wider ecosystem of wheels available to there. There is just that one drawback, which I think is a major consideration. We covered this earlier, but just for those who might have skipped straight to the end of the video, there is that issue with the oscillation in the wheel in PlayStation mode, which I do think is dangerous and something that they need to get on straight away. So as long as they can fix that, absolutely no issues with recommending this at all. I think they've done a really good job overall, and I'm really excited to see where this technology ends up going. I don't think that it's reached its full potential just yet, but yeah, really excited to see some genuine innovation here, and really interested to hear your thoughts on this as well. Have you already picked one of these up? I know there are a few out in the wild already. Let us know what your experience has been like, what other wheelbases you considered when you purchased this, what made you go in this direction, and what you're upgrading from as well. I think it's always really valuable for viewers to hear your experiences, particularly if you're upgrading from something more entry level as well. And yeah, so make sure you share those experiences down in the comments. I'm starting to lose my voice, so I'm going to leave it at that. If you do want to pick one of these up or any other sim racing gear, check out the links down in the description below. That's an awesome way of helping support our work here at Boosted Media at no additional cost, and potentially saving yourselves a little bit of money in the process as well with our discount code. So thanks very much for watching, guys. Talk to you down in the comments, and I will see you again very soon. Bye.